They laughed at her the day she brought him home. A boy nobody wanted. Torn clothes. Empty stomach. No name that mattered to anyone.
You are bringing shame into this house. That boy is nothing. And so are you.
She didn't know that boy would one day own the very ground her family stood on. She didn't know a lawyer was already looking for him. She only knew one thing. Nobody else wanted him. So she did. The rain was falling hard over Enugu that evening when Amaka Nwosu saw him. He was sitting under the broken market shed, knees pulled to his chest, soaked to the skin. Maybe 7 years old. Maybe 8. Nobody could tell. His ribs showed through his shirt. His eyes were empty, the way a child's eyes should never be. Whose child is this? Amaka asked the woman selling groundnuts nearby. The woman shrugged. Nobody's child. His mother died 3 months ago. Fever. No father ever came for him. He sleeps wherever he finds space. Amaka looked at the boy. The boy looked back at her, saying nothing. She was 32 years old. Unmarried. A schoolteacher who earned little and owned less. Her own family already whispered behind her back, "Amaka, when will you bring a husband? When will you bring grandchildren?" She had no answer for that. But standing in the rain, looking at a child with no one in the world, she found an answer to a different question. "Come," she said, holding out her hand. "You will not sleep in the rain tonight." The boy did not move at first. Nobody had said that to him in 3 months. "My name is Amaka," she said gently. "What is your name?" "David," he whispered. "David," she repeated. "Come, David. Let's go home." Her family's compound was large. Her father had built it decades ago with money from his transport business. It was the kind of house where people were measured by what they wore, not who they were. When Amaka walked through the gate holding David's hand, her mother, Mama Ngozi, was sitting on the veranda with a cup of tea. She stood up slowly, staring at the boy like he was a stain on her clean floor. "Amaka. What is this?" "His name is David, Mama. He has no family. I'm bringing him to stay with us." Silence. Then laughter. Not gentle laughter. Cruel laughter. The kind that cuts. "You want to bring a street boy into this house?" Mama Ngozi said. "Amaka, you cannot even take care of yourself. Now you want to be a mother to another woman's forgotten child?" Amaka's chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "He is not forgotten anymore, Mama. I found him." At that moment, her younger sister Ifeoma walked out from inside, dressed in a designer gown, phone in hand, expensive perfume trailing behind her like a warning. Ifeoma was the favorite. The pretty one. The one already engaged to a wealthy businessman's son. She looked David up and down and burst into laughter too. Amaka. See your life. Everybody is chasing money and marriage and you are collecting orphans from the market like firewood." She turned to David. "Small boy, do you know how much shame you are carrying into this house?" David lowered his head. Something inside Amaka cracked, not from weakness, but from fury. "Don't talk to him like that," she said, her voice sharp for the first time. Ifeoma raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Oh. Look at her. Defending a nobody." "He is not a nobody," Amaka said. "Nobody is a nobody." Mama Ngozi shook her head. "You will regret this, Amaka. Mark my words. That boy will bring you nothing but trouble." Amaka took David's hand again and walked past them into the small room at the back of the compound, the room she had lived in since she refused to marry the men her family kept choosing for her. That night, she gave David the only blanket she owned. She sat beside him until he fell asleep, his small fingers still gripping the edge of her sleeve, afraid that if he let go, she would disappear too, like everyone else in his life had. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, even though he was already asleep. I promise you that. The weeks that followed were not easy. Amaka's salary as a teacher was small, but now it had to stretch further. School supplies David didn't have, shoes that fit his growing feet, food that was no longer just for one. Her family made sure she felt every bit of that struggle. How will you feed him and yourself? Her father, Chief Nwosu, asked one evening, not out of concern, but disapproval. You are wasting your life on a child that is not yours. He is mine now, Amaka answered simply. By choice. Isn't that the strongest kind of family there is? Chief Nwosu had no answer for that. He simply shook his head and walked away, the way he always did when he didn't like what he heard. Ifeoma, meanwhile, made it her personal mission to remind Amaka of her place at every family gathering. At a birthday party for their cousin, Ifeoma stood in front of the extended family, holding a glass of wine, and announced with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Everyone, meet my sister's new son. She picked him up from the street like a stray dog. Laughter rippled through the room. David, standing quietly beside Amaka in a shirt 2 sizes too big, stared at the floor. Amaka felt her hands shake. But she knelt down, right there in front of everyone, and looked David in the eyes. Don't listen to them, she said softly, only for him to hear. You are not what they say. You are David. And you are enough. David looked up at her, and for the first time since his mother died, something like hope flickered in his eyes. The room went quiet. Even the aunties who had been laughing moments ago suddenly found their wine glasses very interesting. But not everything was pain. In the small room behind the compound, away from the mockery, something beautiful was growing. Amaka taught David to read using old newspapers. She taught him to write his name with a stick in the sand outside their window. She sang to him when nightmares of his mother's death woke him crying in the dark. Tell me about her, David asked one night. My mother. I never met her, Amaka said gently, but I know she loved you. Because a mother's love doesn't disappear just because she is gone. It lives inside you now. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that broke and healed her heart at the same time. Will you be my mother now? Amaka's eyes filled with tears. If you'll let me, she whispered, I would be honored. That night, for the first time, David didn't cry himself to sleep. He simply held Amaka's hand and closed his eyes, safe. Life found its rhythm. Amaka would wake before sunrise, prepare a small breakfast, walk David to the community school before heading to her own classroom across town. In the evenings, they would sit outside on an old wooden bench, watching the sky change color, David asking 100 questions the way curious children do. Why is the sky orange sometimes? Why do stars disappear in the morning? Why did my mother have to die? That last question, Amaka never had a perfect answer for. But she always held him close and said, I don't know why bad things happen, David. But I know good things can happen after them too. You are proof of that. Slowly, David began to smile more. He began to laugh, a real laugh, the kind that made Amaka's chest fill with warmth every time she heard it. She had no money. No husband. No approval from her family. But in that small room, with a boy who called her mama for the first time on a quiet Sunday morning, Amaka Nwosu had never felt richer. Mama, David said one afternoon, testing the word carefully. Amaka froze, then smiled through sudden tears. Yes, David? Nothing, he said, grinning. I just wanted to say it. She pulled him into a hug so tight he laughed and pretended to complain that she was squeezing him too hard. But he hugged her back just as tight. Peace, however, never lasted long in the Nwosu compound. Ifeoma's wedding to her wealthy fiancé, Chikwudi, was approaching, and the family had transformed the compound into a festival of preparation, caterers, tailors, decorators, all working around the clock. Amaka and David were, as usual, treated as an inconvenience in the middle of it all. Make sure that boy doesn't touch anything, Mom Ngozi warned the staff. He has street hands. David heard it. He said nothing, but Amaka saw the hurt flash across his young face before he learned, too early, how to hide it. At the engagement dinner, Chikwiti's family arrived in expensive cars, dressed like royalty. Introductions were made around the long table. When it came to Amaka and David, Ifeoma didn't hesitate. "This is my sister, Amaka," she said with a tight smile, "and this is the orphan she's raising. Charity case." She laughed lightly, as though she'd made a joke rather than delivered a wound. Chikwiti's mother looked at David with poorly disguised distaste. "How brave of you," she said to Amaka, in a tone that meant the opposite. David sat very still, staring at his empty plate. Under the table, Amaka found his small hand and squeezed it. "You don't need their approval," she whispered. "You have mine. That's enough." But that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Amaka found David sitting outside alone, looking up at the stars. "David? Why aren't you sleeping?" "They don't want me here," he said quietly. "Maybe I should go back to the market. Maybe that's where I belong." Amaka sat beside him, her heart breaking. "Listen to me, David. You belong wherever I am. Do you understand? Their words don't decide your worth. I decide who you are to me, and you are my son. Nothing they say will ever change that." David leaned his head on her shoulder, and they sat together under the stars in silence, two people the world had underestimated, finding strength in each other. It started with something small. A man in a sharp gray suit visited the local school where David was enrolled, asking the headmaster quiet questions about a boy named David, his birth records, the name of his late mother, anything the school might have on file. The headmaster, confused but cooperative, gave what little information existed. The man wrote everything down carefully in a leather notebook and left without explaining who he was. A week later, David came home from school talking about a strange encounter. "Mama, a man asked me my full name today. He asked if my mother's name was Grace. I said yes." He looked surprised. Almost like he was going to cry. Amaka frowned. "What man, David?" "I don't know. He wore a nice suit. He had a car, the kind Ifeoma's fiancé has." Amaka felt an unease she couldn't explain. She asked around discreetly, but no one at the school knew who the man was or why he'd come. Days later, at the market, an old woman who used to sell alongside David's late mother stopped Amaka. "That boy," the woman said, nodding toward David, who was a few steps away examining fruit. "His mother, Grace, she wasn't from here originally, you know. She came from Lagos, many years ago. Ran from something. Never spoke about it. But she used to cry at night, saying a name. Adise. Over and over. Adise?" Amaka repeated. The old woman shrugged. "I don't know what it means. But that woman was hiding from something big. I always felt it." Amaka looked at David, laughing now as he haggled playfully with a fruit seller, unaware that his own history was a locked door slowly creaking open. That night, unable to sleep, Amaka pulled out the small metal box David had brought with him the day she found him, the only possession he had left of his mother. Inside were a few photographs, a faded certificate, and a small gold pendant with initials engraved so worn she could barely make them out. Ayo. She stared at it for a long time, a strange feeling rising in her chest. She didn't know what it meant. But someone, somewhere, was about to. The knock on the compound gate came on a quiet Saturday morning. Chief Nwosu answered it himself, expecting a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, he found a tall man in an immaculate black suit, holding a briefcase, flanked by a driver waiting beside a gleaming black car. "Good morning," the man said politely. "My name is Barrister Emeka Obi. I'm looking for a woman named Amaka Nwosu." "And a boy, David." Chief Nwosu's eyebrows shot up. "Amaka? Since when did lawyers come looking for his forgotten daughter?" "What is this about?" he asked, suspicious. "It's a legal matter," the lawyer said carefully. "A significant one. I'd prefer to explain directly to Miss Nwosu, if you don't mind." Word spread through the compound like wildfire. By the time Amaka came out, wiping flour from her hands after helping in the kitchen. The entire family had gathered, Mom Ngozi, Ifeoma, even Chikwudi, who happened to be visiting. Ifeoma, sensing an opportunity to embarrass her sister further, smirked. "What did you do now, Amaka? Did that street boy steal something?" The lawyer's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I'd choose my words more carefully if I were you," he said calmly. "This street boy, as you call him, is the reason I am here." The smile faded from Ifeoma's face. "David," the lawyer said, turning to the boy who had just walked up beside Amaka, "may I ask, what was your mother's name?" "Grace," David said quietly. "Grace Nwakigo." The lawyer's hands were trembling slightly as he opened his briefcase. "And did she ever tell you about her family? About where she came from?" David shook his head. "She never talked about it. She said it was too painful." The lawyer nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. He pulled out a thick folder and looked directly at Amaka. "6 months ago, I was hired to find a missing family member, the grandson of one of the wealthiest industrialists in this country, Chief Augustine Okafor, founder of Okafor Group Holdings. Before his death 2 years ago, Chief Okafor revealed on his deathbed that his estranged daughter, Adiz Okafor, had run away 20 years earlier after a family conflict, changed her name, and vanished. He spent his final years searching for her, desperate to make peace. He died without finding her. But he left his entire estate, under strict legal conditions, to be transferred to her, or in the event of her passing, to her direct descendant." The compound went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. "Adiz Okafor," the lawyer continued, "changed her name to Grace after she left Lagos. She settled here in Enugu under a new identity, raising her son alone, telling no one who she truly was, likely out of fear, or shame, or both." He held up the small gold pendant Amaka had shown him days earlier when she'd finally, worriedly, reached out to a legal office for answers. "This pendant," he said, "belonged to Adiz Okafor. The initials match. The DNA test we ran last week, using a sample David willingly provided at the school, confirms it beyond doubt." He looked directly at David, his voice thick with emotion. "David, your mother was Adiz Okafor. Which means you are the sole heir to the Okafor Group, one of the largest business empires in this country. Property. Hotels. Shares. All of it. It belongs to you." For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Ifeoma's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the tiled floor. Mom Ngozi's face had gone pale as ash. That's not possible," she stammered. The lawyer's eyes moved slowly across the family, the same family who had laughed at David, called him a nobody, warned Amaka she was wasting her life. "You called him a charity case," the lawyer said quietly, looking at Ifeoma. "You called him a street boy with no future." He turned to Mom Ngozi. "You said he'd bring nothing but shame into this house." He closed the folder gently. "As of this morning, David Nwakigo Okafor is one of the wealthiest young heirs in this country. And the woman who is legally recognized as his guardian," he turned to Amaka, his voice softening with respect, "is you, Amaka. The only person who ever chose him without knowing any of this." Amaka stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with what she'd just heard. David looked up at her, confused and overwhelmed. "Mama? What does this mean?" She knelt down and took his face gently in her hands, tears already falling. "It means the world is finally seeing what I've always seen in you, David. It doesn't change anything between us. Do you hear me? Nothing." But around them, everything had already changed. Mom Ngozi, who moments ago had looked at David with contempt, now stepped forward with a trembling, sudden warmth. "David, my dear boy, come, let me look at you properly." "Don't touch him," Amaka said sharply, standing between her mother and her son. Something in her voice made even Mom Ngozi step back. Ifeoma, recovering from her shock, forced a smile onto her face. "David, I always knew there was something special about you. Didn't I always say so?" You called him a stray dog, Amaka said coldly. 2 weeks ago. At your own engagement dinner. Ifeoma's smile faltered. Chief Nwosu, who had said little throughout the ordeal, cleared his throat. Well. This is wonderful news for the family. We must celebrate. There is no we, Amaka said, her voice steady but firm. There is David. And there is me. The rest of you made your feelings about him very clear when you thought he had nothing to offer. The lawyer, watching the scene unfold, allowed himself a small, knowing nod. He had seen this before, families who discovered value only when it came wrapped in money. There's one more matter, he said carefully. Chief Okafor's will contains a specific clause. The guardian responsible for David's care and upbringing, the person he chooses to trust, has significant influence over the transitional trust until he comes of age. Given what I've observed today, and given David's own wishes, he glanced at the boy, it seems clear who that person is. David didn't hesitate. He walked to Amaka and wrapped his arms around her waist. Her, he said simply. It's her. It's always been her. In the weeks that followed, the compound that once treated Amaka and David like burdens transformed into a stage of desperate performance. Mom Ngozi began preparing David's favorite meals, though she'd never once asked what they were. Ifeoma postponed talk of her own wedding to instead plan a proper celebration for her nephew, a title she'd never once used before. Chief Nwosu, sensing opportunity, approached Amaka privately. Amaka, my daughter, he said, using words he rarely offered her, you understand family must stay together in times like this. Perhaps David could benefit from more guidance. From people with experience managing wealth. You mean people who want access to his money, Amaka said flatly. Her father's silence was answer enough. I've watched you all my life choose reputation over kindness, Amaka continued, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. You want to be near David now because of what he has. Not because of who he is. I won't allow that. Not after everything he's already survived. You would keep a fortune from your own family? Her father asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. I would keep my son safe from people who see him as a fortune instead of a child, Amaka replied. That includes you. She walked away, leaving her father standing alone in the compound he'd once ruled with unquestioned authority. At school, David's life changed overnight. Children who had ignored him now wanted to be his friend. Teachers who had barely noticed him now praised his every word. It confused him deeply. Mama, why is everyone being nice to me now? He asked one evening. Nothing about me changed. I'm the same David. Amaka pulled him close, her heart aching at the wisdom already forming in such a young mind. You're right, David. You haven't changed at all. Only what people know about you has changed. That's why real love, the kind that sees you before the world does, is the only love worth trusting. David nodded slowly, processing this in the quiet way he always did. Is that why you're the only one I trust completely? He asked. Amaka's eyes filled with tears. I hope so, David. I truly hope so. 6 months later, the Okafor group held a formal gathering to publicly announce the young heir and the transition of leadership under the newly established trust. Enugu's most prominent business families, government officials, and members of the press filled the grand ballroom of the Okafor Grand Hotel, a property David now legally owned, though he barely understood the scale of it. Amaka stood beside him on the stage, dressed simply but elegantly, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Ifeoma, Mom Ngozi, and Chief Nwosu sat in the audience, invited only as distant family, no longer the center of influence they once assumed they'd become. Barrister Obi took the podium. 2 years ago, Chief Augustine Okafor died searching for the daughter he lost to a family conflict decades earlier, he began, his voice carrying through the silent hall. He never found her. But fate, and one woman's uncommon kindness, completed his search for him. He gestured toward Amaka. Amaka Nwosu is not related to David by blood. She owes him nothing by tradition or obligation. Yet when she found him abandoned, hungry, and grieving, in the rain, with nothing to offer her in return, she chose him anyway. While others mocked her decision, his eyes moved briefly toward the Nwosu family in the audience. She never once wavered. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Ifeoma sank lower in her seat. Today, David Okafor inherits not just wealth, the lawyer continued, but a family that chose him before they knew what he was worth. I can think of no better foundation for the future of this company. The room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. But David wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Amaka. "Mama," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "none of this matters without you." Amaka knelt slightly, despite the elegant dress, and hugged him tightly in front of everyone. "You matter to me, David. You always have. Money or none, that will never change." After the ceremony, Mom Ngozi approached Amaka quietly, away from the crowd, her earlier arrogance replaced with something that looked almost like shame. "Amaka," she said softly, "I was wrong. Not just about David. About you. You have always been stronger than any of us understood. I laughed at your kindness because I didn't understand it. I'm sorry." Amaka studied her mother's face for a long moment. Forgiveness didn't come instantly, the wounds were too old, too deep for that. But something in her softened. "I don't need you to make it up to me, Mama," she said honestly. "But if you want to be part of David's life, it has to be real. Not because of what he has. Because of who he is." Mom Ngozi nodded, tears in her eyes. "I understand." Ifeoma's apology came slower and shakier, but it came. "I was jealous," she admitted quietly one afternoon, staring at her hands rather than her sister's face. "You had something I didn't, a love that didn't care about appearances. I mocked what I secretly wished I had the courage for." Amaka reached out and, for the first time in years, embraced her sister without reservation. "It's not too late to learn, Ifeoma. Start with him. He forgives easier than any of us." Years passed. David grew from a quiet, wounded boy into a thoughtful young man, guided not by the wealth surrounding him, but by the values Amaka had planted in that small room behind the compound: kindness before comfort, character before class, love before everything else. Under the trust's guidance, and with Amaka's steady presence beside him, David used a portion of the Okafor fortune to build something his mother, Grace, Adiz, would have been proud of: shelters and schools for children exactly like he once was. Forgotten. Overlooked. Deserving of a chance. He named the first shelter Amaka House. At its opening, a journalist asked him why. David looked toward Amaka, standing quietly near the back of the crowd, the same steady presence she'd been since the rainy evening she found him. "Because," he said, "everyone else saw a poor orphan and looked away. She saw a child who simply needed someone to stay. That's what saved me. Not money. Her." Amaka wiped away tears she didn't try to hide, and when David reached the end of his speech and stepped down from the podium, he didn't walk toward the officials or the cameras. He walked straight to her, and hugged her the way he had that very first rainy night, like she was the only steady thing in an uncertain world. "I love you, Mama," he whispered. "I love you too, David," she whispered back. "I always have. Long before the world knew who you were." They laughed at her for loving a boy with nothing. They never understood, she wasn't looking for what he had. She was looking for someone who needed her heart. And in the end, that love became the richest inheritance of all.